I would say, I mean, I keep thinking about the work in South Africa and how how that has taught me so much about my own processes in a way. And there was a piece I made called 6,671 Days, which was um, walking up in the landscape in the cradle of humankind, gathering that number of loose stones and forming them into groups like bodily forms that the work was about marking my son's birth to the day he left home, and it was a kind of piece about marking time. But the rows and groups of 50, 50 is symbolic of regeneration and our connection to the universe and sky. And so it was a really profound thing to kind of almost like a space of mourning, organizing these amazing layers out in the landscape. And it was a piece that was never to be seen. So it was even more incredible to be up there doing it, knowing that I was simply allowed to roam and make work. And then the stones later were reused for a piece called 18,088 Days, which I did with a Swedish foundation in collaboration with the Nirox Foundation. This forming of a kind of contemplative space was really how in many ways the book was formed. The book is really the more intimate thoughts around my process of making. It's really a collection of fragments, and it's made in such a similar way to this idea of forming through an intuitive process of accruing and gathering and letting things unfold over time. So I worked on it for 7 years and came to it and left it and came to it and left it. And the thing about spiritual practice and thing of spaces of contemplative spaces or is it takes a really a long time to kind of deconstruct or space and time and reduce something to something very uh, sort of so it kind of holds meaning, but it's I suppose what I'm trying to say is I produced for so many years. I've been manically working, and so part of the task is to kind of is to kind of sift through all that, including in the paintings I make. It's taken, maybe 20 years to be able to create something truly minimal. So maybe I'll create a painting now that won't have a lot in it, but it's the decades of experience in other countries and being amongst ordinary people and other cultures and forcing myself to learn how different mediums react with different papers in different countries and all those things that have led me to understand and to minimize in the work. And I think the other question was about my influences. And I really feel that, when I was at art college in the 90s in Edinburgh, I spent a day a week at the Fine Art Library just by choice, reading interviews by artists and also by writers. Some of the books I read Virginia Woolf's letters and Kokoschka's letters and actually Mozart's letters, funnily enough, and also David Sylvester's interviews with the American painters, basically, and Francis Bacon as well, but read a lot over that time and learned a lot about breaking rules in painting and how, with those particular interviews of the American painters by David Sylvester, Jasper Johns, for example, used the alphabet to deconstruct the plane or to carve up the space as a sort of tool. And then you have these incredible, like evocative, uh, enormous monochrome paintings by Robert Motherwell, where he talks about mopping a ship's deck under a dark, starry sky. And then he says calm anxiety, anxious solitude. And I really identify with that. Just that fact, the fact of the sort of powerful unconscious space that comes into the work, and how in life I'm so sort of inhibited. And then in the work itself, there's something very powerful going on when you decide to channel this energy or as it were, if that makes sense. Even Louise Bourgeois talks about being a mouse behind a refrigerator um, in life, and then in her work being all powerful. And I just understand that thing of, for me, I mean, the sad thing is I think a huge amount of my life has been living in the work rather than in life. And I think that's something I've had to battle with and overcome and change. Um, but maybe that's, partly why I've done this book, is to kind of understand what it is I've been trying to do, and kind of conceive and understand how I've created a sort of this idea of the metaphor, or the shadow, or this sense of a space beyond, I mean, the thing about spiritual work is it can become very challenging. This sort of fine line that exists between, almost, I've described it before as a veil that exists between the physical world and spiritual world. And if you're open to being led by the medium that you work with, the materials, and and using these kind of very ethereal processes, with ink and water, for example, you can be taken to a very extreme place, whether it's in writing too. For example, the building of my library, I was writing to a curator for 5 years and totally lost myself to my imagination and crossed into the space of another realm, and it's painful. But when you're trying to build something and form a language, well, you almost have to kind of enter that madness in order to pull yourself back. But it's partly why I stopped in 2018. And it was so great to reconnect with all my writings and also the writings of other artists, and to include a few of those in the book, who have helped me to understand this path that I'm on. It's been such a great support, somebody who reads a lot, and to kind of understand how other people navigate their work has really helped me to develop as an artist. So the building of the library started with a collection of fairy tales given to me by my mother. And alongside them in my studio, I had a small collection of books called The New Book of Knowledge. And that inside of that book was a tiny little paragraph that talked about their ambition to spread knowledge and to spread information but the way it was written was so intimate and personal, and it really struck me that before the internet, things were written differently, when the writer or author knew and was conscious of the fact that this was his only print run going out into the world. And there's something very moving about that. So I started to read all the prefaces. I mean, this was at the same time the library started being formed, after a conversation as well with Gus Casely-Hayford, who's director of V&A East, who talked about neglected libraries in Mali in Africa, and how he'd just come back from seeing them. And at that time, I'd been deconstructing or taking apart these Chinese herbal medicine texts, which I'd found in a market, which were absolutely beautiful. They were 150 years old, watermarked, sort of clearly had lived such a life. And when I took apart the book itself, which was threaded together with no cover, it just was the pages themselves, they would unfold into the most beautiful kind of forms of decay and kind of history. I mean, they had such a sense of their own presence and journey. And I brought to them a single line drawing in oil. And it was at that time I was really struggling in China with unlearning everything I'd learned about how ink responds to paper, because the rice papers are so different to European papers. And that was immensely challenging, and learning with a philosopher and painter how to do that, how to really understand how to kind of channel energy in a different way to the American abstract expressionists who have influenced me, but more about really understanding how energy travels through the body and then the mind to the arm to the hand. But similar in the sense that it is mind to paper, and it's about being in a very present state when you're making work. So coming through the unconscious mind, as it were. And I mean, Jung, who I've read quite a lot as well, talks about images existing in us before we're born. And, I have often seen images at night that then come out in the work the next day. And it's really powerful to trust that space in spiritual practice, I think. But the library, um, so it came through speaking to the ideas started to form through speaking to Gus and also Richard DeMarco at Summerhall in Edinburgh, who I hadn't seen for years because I lived in Edinburgh when my children were young. And he took me into a library in Summerhall, which is dedicated to science and the arts. And he said this library, and I couldn't believe the energy coming off the library because there was something so beautiful about its arrangement. And he was so glad that I picked up on it. And he said the National Gallery of Scotland has no offing. And I asked him about offing, and he said that Joseph Conrad used the word to describe beyond the ship's horizon, what sailors talked about, the space beyond that they would see. And they would always imagine they were seeing land. And but so it was this sense of something truly beyond. And he got that, I got it, and that was the beginning for me of thinking about that, and seeing a library in Damascus in Syria in 2009 as well, where I saw a kind of hidden library belonging to the grandfather of somebody in this shop. And he opened the back of the shop and to the most incredible library that belonged to his grandfather. And I realized for the first time, I thought about a library as a kind of construct to memory. And it just, all of the work is about this sense of carrying history and memory, whether it's the landscapes history in the paintings, or whether it's in the library, the idea that a book is lived through many lives and passages of time, and that it carries something of its own history and emanates something of that. And that energy comes off of the collective work. And when I showed this library in the Getty Museum, it was for a show on Plato, and Plato talked a lot about the sensory imagination. And languages are not made, but they grow over time. And I really feel that about my work, that without any of these, the work's been so opened up by the experiences I've had in other countries. And there's this, I see the same in these books that began with these voices talking so passionately about their subjects. Of the library I created is about beyond borders, these universal subjects that connect us as humans. And so in it are books on astrology, nature, geology, mathematics, physics, homekeeping. And then it's arranged through the titles to read quite poetically. For example, you'll have feminine frailty next to man the world over, next to a book on psychology. But there's something about the titles when you create an inventory that read very poetically. So again, but I read the prefaces of all 900 of those books. Honestly, I don't think I've ever been through anything so moving as seeing a third edition of a book on electricity with someone becoming blind, writing about how passionate he felt this next edition was. And, it just has such a different feel to it, the fact that they knew that this was it, this one print run was it. Now we're just so flooded with, we can put our work and everything everywhere. And actually, I think there's a sense of a loss of quality as a result. But I'm glad this book, it's been a long, it's been 7 years, and I feel like I understand my work better from doing it. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.